Good morning, Tiffany. How are you?
Good morning. Hi, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I think this is going to be a phenomenal episode that our viewers are going to find really helpful. And I know they'll probably want to reach out to you afterwards and ask you some more specific questions as well. But for now, let's keep it somewhat general. If you don't mind, for our audience, please give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me today. So, I am a licensed paralegal. I'm licensed by the Law Society of Ontario, and I am licensed to work in a variety of fields, but today, and more specifically, I've been focusing on criminal and quasi criminal offenses, which are more well known as the driving offenses. So that's what I would like to speak about today. And I've been licensed for the past 5 years, and I've operated my own business. I started off in general litigation, kind of doing a little bit of everything, and then I realized I really, really love the quasi-criminal realm. So the businesses, the fire code violations, the everyday person that just so happened to find themselves in a little bit of a legal trouble. That's where I really like to practice.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. I know I've certainly enjoyed, working with you in the past and knowing you in the past as well. And I'm really happy that this is really impactful for not just you, but for the community and the people that you work with as well, of course. What are some of your favorite sort of clients or cases that you get to deal with that really just gets you excited when that client calls you or walks in through the door and you're like, yes, I can't wait to tackle this one?
Well, actually, to be honest, it's the clients that they just need a little bit of information. They don't necessarily need to hire me for anything. They just need a little bit of information and they're on their way. And to be honest, I mean, that's not the best for a business, but that is one of the main reasons why I do what I do. I do a lot of pro bono work because I find there's a lot of things within my industry that are not well publicized,
Right.
and a little bit of information can go a long way. So I'm hoping to share a little bit of that information today and hopefully save somebody a lot of stress. I find with different industries that can be the case. So with mine, if I have someone that comes to me and they said, we're so overwhelmed. I had this one case. This young man received. He was pulled over by the police and he was given a charge, and he was actually charged under the wrong act and the wrong section number.
Oh,
So
no.
that was a quick, don't worry about it. The officer does have time to relay the charge, but in that scenario, I was able to tell them, like, listen, it didn't make it past the filing clerk at the registrar's office. So this specific ticket you don't have to worry about, and just keep your eyes out for the mail. If you don't get anything in the mail within the next 6 months, then you're off the hook. Easy as that.
Fantastic. Wow. Yeah, we have to remember sometimes even police officers, they do make mistakes as well. They're human, right? And so sometimes those mistakes can be of a bit of an advantage, I suppose, right, when it comes to these sorts of matters. You know that obviously my clientele, primarily I deal with a lot of self-employed individuals like real estate agents, mortgage brokers and insurance brokers and so on. So I find that there's a bit of an issue when it comes to sometimes people going into real estate thinking I'm going to be self-employed, even if I had that you know, little tarnished spot on my criminal record or on my driver's abstract. That is not something that I need to worry about because I'm going to be self-employed for the rest of my life and I'm going to be making big money. Now I know that obviously for a lot of different associations and societies and things like that, you still have to submit either a character reference or actually a criminal background check. So any sort of suggestions or tips or advice that you can give to individuals that are heading into the field of, whether it's real estate or any other field that where they will be primarily self-employed.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point to bring up, because I think that is one of the common misconceptions, is that, especially in that, a criminal record check or even a driving abstract is only important for work purposes. And then
Right.
they think, I'm going to be self-employed, so I don't have to worry about that. But actually you do, because in order to sustain a self-employed career, of course, you may want to serve on a board in a paid or unpaid capacity. They'll require that background check. You may want to hold a volunteer position to kind of, broaden your clientele and to give back to the community in a meaningful way. So in order to volunteer, a lot of them require police checks as well. And even in terms of your everyday family life, a lot of people don't understand when it comes to the custody of your children, if unfortunately you have to go through a divorce, the courts take things like that into account. So if you're someone who, you have a DUI on your record and drinking ends up being an issue, and I will preface this by saying, please don't take anything as legal advice. This is just a casual conversation. Always have a conversation with someone who's licensed to practice in that area. But just as a general tip, it is important to pay attention, because that can be taken into account anytime your character is being called into question. Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. I know you and I were sort of chatting offline, sorry, about a particular real estate professional that got pulled over and had gotten into a little bit of not an altercation. I'm not going to call it that, but there was definitely a change of demeanor. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, obviously, without disclosing any confidential information?
Yes, of course. So just in a broad sense, I did have a real estate agent come to me. And the reason why I'm disclosing the profession is because that was actually part of the interaction. And so basically they had been pulled over and for a cell phone, which I find those cell phone charges really affect the working professionals the most, because who's going to be checking their emails at the red light, right? Who's going to be adjusting that GPS? It's usually a mom or someone on their way to work or someone on their way to a client. So I find that affects professionals more. Anyways, he came to me and he had a cell phone charge. But the real issue, first of all, he was shocked at the fine, which is that's not actually the most shocking thing about the cell phone charges themselves. So the initial fine for the cell phone charge is almost $700 after the various fees that are tacked onto that. That's a little bit, that's a little bit hard to swallow. But on top of that, you also have the demerit points, and this is the kicker, a 3-day license suspension upon conviction. Conviction is whether you're found guilty at trial, you've pled guilty, or you've paid the fine. So unfortunately, he had already paid the fine, and then he found out about the license suspension. So he wanted to know if there was anything we could do about that. But also he brought up the fact that when he mentioned to the police officer that he was a real estate agent, apparently the demeanor changed. And I believe it was kind of presented to me that that's where it went from a warning to an actual charge. Mm-hmm. So what my business could do for him at that point is put forward a complaint against the police, any possible police misconduct, because it's not supposed to be like that. If you were going to receive a warning in the first place, a conversation about your profession should not have changed that reasonable decision-making ability that the police officer has. So going forward, we address the officer's attitude and conduct. And in terms of the suspension, unfortunately, he had already paid the fine. Right. So you're admitting guilt. And there's a lot of offenses, driving offenses, that people don't understand are absolute liability offenses, which means you don't have to know that you're breaking the law in order to be charged and convicted. Speeding, for example, is one of those absolute liability offenses. So we get a lot of Americans coming over here and they say, well, I didn't realize I was going that fast.
Right.
But it doesn't matter. they have certain evidence that you've broken the law, you're now charged, and you could potentially be convicted if you don't get some help.
Right. Got it. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point about paying the fine. And therefore having that admission of guilt, essentially, not essentially, it's factual, right? And so there's kind of nothing to dispute after the fact. I mean, we have something similar in HR when it comes to terminations. Once the employee has worked a certain number of years, there is usually a liability document that we ask them to sign. Now, it is customary that we give the employee or the terminated employee enough time to review the documents, to consult a legal professional to make sure that everything is the way that it's supposed to be, of course. And so if we as HR professionals ask someone to sign that document on the same day, and that happens actually very often, where they say, hey, Tiffany, you're not leaving my office until you sign this document. I mean, that is considered duress. And so people often, not knowing that, will sign the document, then we'll consult a lawyer, and the lawyer will generally say, there's nothing I can do. You've already signed the liability release form, and therefore, we can't go back and dispute anything, which is very unfortunate. So, so the moral of the story is don't pay fines and don't sign any documents the day of. Make sure you have proper time to consult.
And it's so painful for me as a legal practitioner to hear about, because we offer free consultations.
Right.
That's the thing. That's another thing I think people don't really understand about our profession is you're not going to be charged for giving us a ring and asking us a quick question, because potentially the reasoning behind that is if we can do something to help you, then we'll let you know, right? If there can be something to be done about it. And then at that point you choose whether or not you want to hire us after you know exactly how much it's going to cost you and exactly what the process is. Everything's explained in a free phone call. So it's really painful to hear. The other really painful one is when people just don't do anything at all and they just leave it. And that one, it's so painful for me, again, because there's a free consultation. And if you took that free consultation, I would be able to inform you that you can be convicted in your absence. So that ticket, whatever it may be, it's still going to affect you. It's still going to be applied. Let's say it's just a simple speeding ticket, not really, much penalties to it other than the fine and maybe some demerit points. And an increase in your insurance charge. So just a basic, simple speeding charge, you leave it alone. You're like, no, I'm not going to pay it. And I don't think I was speeding, so I'm just going to leave it. I'm not going to do anything about it. That goes back to the ministry. You're convicted in absentia, in your absence, and it goes back to the ministry, and that'll be placed on your driver's license. So when you go to renew your plates or renew your driver's license, you will not be able to until you pay off those fees. So...
Absolutely. I think there's still a stigma, right? I think there's a stigma about both legal professionals, paralegals as well, and then being obviously convicted or at least accused of anything, where we sort of, I think, naturally kind of want to hold that information to ourselves and not tell anyone because it's shameful, right? But with that being said, I think most of us, I mean, me included, certainly aren't educated enough on the proper procedures and how someone like you and your company can actually save people a lot of money. If you don't mind, can you give me an example of that, about a substantial charge and obviously, coming to you and making sure that you can save some money potentially, as much as probably sometimes half, right? Half of that ticket, I would assume.
Yes, definitely. So it's a little bit tricky. So like you said, there's so much information, there's so much details, but that's the whole reason why it's an actual profession. Because you're not expected. You have your own real estate, business that you're focusing on, and which is a lot of work. Your brain can only hold so much information at a time. So
absolutely.
So just seek other experts in the field. One of the offenses. So just to preface, we can never promise this because there's a lot of variable factors.
Sure.
The variable factors will depend on how much money we can potentially save you. So although I can't promise, I can share an example of something that I've done for a client in the past. They came to me, they had multiple vehicles. They had insurance on the one vehicle, they did not have insurance on the other vehicle. They had heard, and this is kind of a rumor floating around, but they had heard that if you have insurance on one vehicle, it'll automatically cover the other vehicle that you may own. That's not true. The other vehicle has to be added to the policy, but this was his belief. And so that's why he didn't have insurance on his vehicle. So he was actually a business owner himself, well established in the community. And he ended up with a charge for driving with no insurance. I'm just going to take a quick peek at my notes here because all of them are so intricate. Let me see. Yeah, the first fine after all of the charges, because there's additional fees on top of the actual charge.
Right.
So that first fine is a minimum of $6,250.
Oh my goodness.
That's minimum because in the law, in the statute, it's a minimum $5,000. So if you think about it, especially in terms of people who are maybe having trouble keeping up with their bills, and that's the reason why they don't have car insurance, and they're just trying to get to work to make ends meet, you're going to go lay another $5,000 charge on them. That can be devastating for some people. So thankfully, in this area, there is actually an argument and a legal test that I can put forward to ask the judge to lower that statutory minimum amount. Yes. So in this specific scenario, I was able to get that lowered. And then on top of my fees, this person ended up paying 50% of that original charge. So originally it was $6,250 minimum if he just pled guilty and, didn't pay for my fees just off the bat. So we're not talking about demerit points. We're not talking about a conviction on his insurance.
Right.
He's going to have to go to high risk insurance now. And a lot of those companies, if you have a charge for no insurance, you actually have to pay for the whole year up front. So there's no month after.
Fascinating. I did not know that.
It's very expensive. So thankfully in this case, I was able to work my magic. And even after paying me my fees, he still ended up only paying $3,000. So
wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it can get quite expensive. So even though we charge a fee for what we do, because in some cases we are holding a full trial, just like you see in criminal court. It's an actual full trial. The client may or may not have to show up in a lot of the matters, a lot of the cases. The client actually doesn't have to show up. So missing that time off work is another way we're saving you money. We're taking the stress of handling the matter off your hands because you have to keep in contact with the court during every stage of the process. So it's really nice to be able to say, okay, I'll give you a little bit of money up front. You handle everything. And then at the end of the day, we end up saving you money as well.
That's amazing. And it's incredible to think how fast those fees can potentially stack up and how much they can impact your financial well-being for potentially years to come, right? With the increased insurance and everything else. So paying that fee, could not only make sure that you have job security because you're not missing that time off of work, which could potentially, make some bosses pretty angry, right? It's your responsibility. Why are you taking so much time off to deal with this matter where you should have known better? And it gets into this kind of a he said, she said scenario, right? So we're always trying to avoid that as well. And on the HR side of things as well, I mean, that's something that we deal with when somebody has to attend court. And again, how much sort of wiggle room, how much leeway do we have? We do have obviously legal responsibilities to ensure that they're able to attend, but it gets into performance issues and all kinds of other things that could potentially threaten their employment down the road as well. So
yeah. And actually just sharing that story, it reminded me about your profession as well and how much money you can save people by setting them up with the right person for the job. I've worked at a couple different places where they've made some hiring mistakes, and not just in hiring the wrong person for the position, but in how they managed that employee. So when you let someone go, how much severance pay are they actually entitled to? I did work for this one company. The person that they let go received so much more severance than they were entitled to. So I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, if they had just reached out to a professional, you would have saved so much money.
For sure. And sometimes, companies do err on the side of caution and overpay severance and termination. And sometimes that's a good thing because it really protects them from any sort of further liability. But definitely, I've even seen some of my previous clients that have shared stories from the past before they started working with me of them overpaying quite gruesomely. And
it was a lot.
Yeah. So definitely don't want to do that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, hiring decisions, the cost of recruitment, the cost of opportunity to a manager, as opposed to working with a recruiter or an HR professional to find them the right people, as opposed to taking focus away from their business to be able to do that, is actually quite crucial as well, and could be very detrimental to the business as a whole, right? Especially for senior level roles. Talking about criminal records and driver's abstracts and things like that, can you tell me a little bit about how long these offenses stay on the record? And then, of course, from my point of view, it affects employability for certain positions. That's for sure, especially when you're dealing with confidential information or any sort of sensitive information at all. And how people can, once the conviction is there, how they can potentially go about striking it from the record, if that's even a thing, or potentially having the process of having it removed from the record. I'm not sure what the technical terms are, so please correct me.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question, because people, I think there's kind of a misconception that it will fall off your record after a certain length of time.
Does it not?
No, okay. At least that's what I hear. I hear some people say, well, that was ages ago. That couldn't possibly affect me now. But charges on your criminal record and your driving abstract, they're actually there for life. Now, here's the other part to that, though. So if you're charged under the Youth Act, of course, that's not going to carry into your adult criminal record. But if you were charged as an adult, that's going to be on your record for life until you apply for a record suspension. In the US, we call them pardons. In Canada, we call them record suspensions. And what that does, so you have to qualify. So it depends on the circumstances of your case, what you were charged with, how long ago, what the result was. But if you qualify, if you pass that eligibility criteria, you can actually pay a fee, fill out an application, and apply to the Parole Board of Canada to receive a record suspension. There is a legal test that you must meet in order to qualify, and that's kind of laid out in the application. That's what you want to show you meet in the application. And that's where hiring someone to help you with this, it'll save you money again because you don't have to try again. You can be denied if you don't meet that test.
Right.
And it costs a fee. Thankfully, they just decreased the fee. It used to be $1,000, and now I think it's $487 just to apply. And then you're going to pay someone to help you with it another $300, right? But that money is going towards making sure you don't have to pay that filing fee again. So that is one way if you qualify and if you're successful. Right. And what happens then is the charge never actually leaves your record, but it gets sealed. So it gets closed. So you can't be judged against it. You'll know on the employment forms, right? I believe the actual verbiage is, have you been convicted of a crime that you have not yet received
pardon for?
Pardon for. Yes. So if you've received a pardon, you don't have to check that box because you've received a pardon, right?
Right.
For the policing agencies, the local policing agencies, they're not going to see that anything's there. So if you get pulled over, they're not going to see a criminal record.
Got it. Okay.
Yes. They may, however, see that there was an interaction if you had to do fingerprints. So that's a secondary step. So you don't just apply for the record suspension, you also apply for fingerprint sealing. And what that does is the RCMP actually holds all of these long-term files. And they'll actually kind of close that file, and they write on it, not to be opened unless you commit a serious offense, like a really serious offense, like murder, right? Then that's the only time that stuff might be able to come back up. Otherwise, it's sealed and you are able to re-enter society as if you have a clean record.
Right.
In terms of the driving abstract, that's where a lot of people are confused, because if you order a 3-year abstract or a 5-year abstract, you may not see something that was 6 years ago.
Right.
But if you have to dispute a charge, the prosecutor is actually going to pull that record for themselves. They're going to pull the lifetime record, and they may still be able to use that in their arguments and in their decisions on, whether or not they can offer you a plea deal, or whether they're going to argue something at sentencing. They're going to say, well, look, they've been doing well for the past 3 years, but 4 years ago, this was really an issue, or something like that. So in terms of the driving record, there's no kind of pardon system to get those off. They're there. But in terms of criminal records, very useful for criminal court, crossing the border, employment, volunteer opportunities. Very important to get that issue looked at.
I remember a really long time ago, I was working, and this is when I think the use of marijuana for personal recreational purposes was just becoming legalized. And so the company that I worked for had a policy that everybody had to do a mandatory police check. And so we've had a lot of people who had that on their record and had been charged with possession, if I'm not mistaken, but were in the process of having that removed or pardoned, right? And so, but that process hasn't finished yet. So they did disclose the information that they had been caught with possession. And so we were sort of in this very, very sticky situation where we weren't quite sure, because it was just in the process of being legalized. And so, 6 months down the road, this charge wouldn't have mattered anymore. But knowing that this person has committed relatively minor, infraction, but nonetheless, considering the company policy, it really put us in a very awkward position. So we had to make a lot of sort of these judgment calls, I guess, based on, what we saw them doing, how long ago this charge was, of course, and all of these things. What is your personal opinion on this? How would you have handled it? What steps would you have taken in order to make that judgment call?
Right. It puts HR professionals in such a sticky position.
Totally.
The impression that I receive from the legal industry and from the courts is that at the time that charge was laid, the law was the law, and marijuana was illegal, no matter how small the amount. So at that time, that person did break the law. So it's not necessarily that now everyone's going to receive pardons for marijuana offenses, because at that time, the law was the law and they broke it. So it's not 100% slam dunk that the record suspensions are going to go through. However, I think now, we're obviously a little bit softer for people who have those charges on their record, because, okay, we understand, if it had been a couple years sooner, right, then it wouldn't be there. But the courts take the view that at the time it was illegal. So therefore, it is on your record, and you don't necessarily just receive a pardon just for that.
Automatically, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating subject, just because I mean I've never really been a part of such a big change and such a common issue where we
Yes.
had to make a lot of these decisions. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in Canada versus the U.S., there's a difference in how much information is actually presented on a background check. Am I correct in saying that? I mean, I've never worked with anybody in the U.S. I don't believe. But I find that the U.S. records, from what I've heard, are a lot more descriptive.
That may be. I actually haven't seen a criminal record from the US personally, but I do know that they rate certain charges a bit differently,
Right.
especially in terms of crossing the border. So if you did have something on your record and it's a summary conviction offense, let's say, for example, you're having an argument with your spouse and you
Right.
just so happen to be holding a remote control, you can actually be charged with an assault.
That's usually how most arguments start, is it not?
I know. Heavens forbid you're cooking in the kitchen. Just put the knife down. Don't
Yeah,
do
good
that.
tip,
Yes.
good tip.
Right. But if the neighbors hear you yelling and they call the police on you and the police show up, and you're still holding that remote, right? Assault with a weapon comes to mind. So that might be too extreme of an example, but there's different levels of assault charges, right? So the most basic one would be an assault level 1, which is it's minor, right? It's a very minor charge. So that's kind of something, but it sounds egregious, right?
Sounds
Assault.
terrifying.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
you think you had to go and punch somebody in the face to be
Right.
charged with that. That's not the case at all. So let's say you have an assault level 1 on your record, because at the time you just didn't know how to handle it, so you got convicted. Trying to cross the border, right? They're going to actually view that charge, even though it's a level 1 over here, they actually rate that charge so much higher over in the US. And it could potentially be because in the US, maybe they wouldn't have laid that charge for that situation, but they do kind of classify charges a little bit differently. And weed, I know, is 100%, it's a big no-no for crossing the border. Yeah, people think that because it's legal in Canada, they're going to take a softer approach. But if it's illegal in Detroit, Michigan, and you're trying to cross that border, nothing, no residue in your purse. Honestly, don't even admit to smoking it, because that's another reason they can deny you going into the country. And yeah, they take it very seriously. So there is a little bit of a difference in terms of what the actual abstracts look like. I'm sure they look a little bit different. I haven't seen a US one, but I know they classify charges differently, so that would make sense.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And I do appreciate your time. I'm sure this was really, really useful information to a lot of our viewers. If they do need to get in touch with you, how do they contact you?
Yes, of course. So I believe I'm plastered everywhere online. It's just bauerlegal.ca. You'll find my phone number. Send me an email, send me a text, reach out to me anyway, because again, we have that free discovery phone call, the free consultation. And I find it's really that free consultation, I would say probably about 75% of the calls that I receive, it's a quick answer that I can give them and they're on their way. They actually don't have to retain me for anything. So I'm here as a resource, and I would love to get your calls. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. To conclude, if you are thinking about doing something that's on the wrong side of the law, don't do it. But if you do find yourself accidentally on the wrong side of the law, call Tiffany Bauer. Thanks so much, Tiffany. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.